Good afternoon here in the East Coast. Good morning in the West Coast. Good evening in Europe and Asia and beyond. I'm Joel Hellman. I'm Dean of the School of Foreign Service, and I want to welcome you to another one of our SFS Fast Breaks. Today, on a really significant issue which has a tremendous impact on global trade and indeed the global economic order, trade and tariffs after the Trump administration, the tsunami of executive orders and how they're impacting trade and tariff. We're here today with Professor Marc Busch. He's the Karl Landegger Professor of International Diplomacy at our school at SFS. He's also, and you can read his biweekly commentary in The Hill on trade and tariff issues. He's a regular commentator on trade policy, a consultant to governments, private sector, international institutions on trade and tariffs. And he is also a three-time SFS parent. So it's wonderful to have Marc Busch here. The rules of the road: this is a 30-minute conversation between Marc and myself. You are welcome in the question and answers to throw questions into the Q&A. I will be monitoring them, and I will integrate those questions into the conversation. So we won't have a question and answer period, but I will try to monitor and bring those questions in so we can have a flowing conversation across the 30 minutes. So you'll see the question and answers coming in through that. I won't be naming the individuals who put out the questions, but we'll be trying to get as many in as we can. So let me start. Professor Busch, where are we on the issue of tariffs? Can give us a level set of where we are at the moment and what we expect to see, especially in the next 30 days. And indeed, it's recorded. So if someone did ask that, and it is recorded.
We have three fundamental waves of tariffs that we've got to be tracking. And the first one was supposed to unfold just a couple of days ago. And obviously, we have a 30-day pause. That was with respect to the tariffs on Canada and Mexico. 25% on everything except energy from Canada, 10% on energy, and 25% on Mexico. Issued under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, the idea was to, in some way, use tariffs to stem the flow of fentanyl and illegal immigration to the United States. And deals were struck north and south, and so the 30-day reprieve. Hard to believe that we are going to have heard the last word on the issue, but the 30-day reprieve has taken hold, and now the question is whether there will be more to it, whether more commitments from Canada and Mexico will be required to extend that for a little while further. With respect to China, the tariffs are in place, and the Chinese have retaliated. So that has a bit of a different feel to it, and clearly there are some pretty provocative moves by the Chinese to retaliate. There would have been, as I'm sure we'll talk about, with respect to both Canadian and Mexican retaliation, had that been called for. But phase one, wave one, put that aside for a second. Wave two, not making a lot of media headlines at the moment. This will be the end of March, end of the ceasefire between the US and the European Union on steel and aluminum tariffs, ironically dating from Trump 1.0. This will not be solved anytime soon, certainly not by the end of March. That's for philosophical reasons. The US wants a tariff-based solution, and Europe would like to see something more akin to the carbon border adjustment mechanism being the centerpiece of any solution agreed. One day later, we'll get wave three. Wave three will be the fallout from all the studies that Trump called for in his inaugural memo on an America First trade policy. Lots and lots of studies done by lots and lots of departments and agencies. One mystery is whether we don't already have answers percolating in the White House even before the studies are done. But the studies are provocative. Most of them would have been issued by a President Harris, so I don't want to put this all on President Trump. But it will be interesting to see what the fallout is. Some of the fallout will concern countries that are deemed to be cheating the United States in ways real and perceived. Some will be to revamp certain tools that have been left dormant for a few years, including with respect to anti-dumping and countervailing duties. And here's where I'll stop my answer, Joel. In the background to all three waves will be a surge in U.S. anti-dumping and countervailing duties. The difference will be Trump won't be calling the shots on that. Those will be firm filed, and we can expect that to be enhanced as it was under Trump 1.0 by virtue of the fact that he, in one of his studies, is calling for a new look at a methodology called zeroing, which will make it much easier for the Department of Commerce to come in with big margins on both anti-dump and countervail.
So this is an important point that we obviously now focused on Mexico and Canada and the 30-day window, China, what is immediately received. But what you're saying, of course, is that there are multiple waves to come, and they impact the EU, they impact other things at the firm level. But let's focus a little bit on the Mexico-Canada story, because obviously that's a high-profile one. What's going to happen in these 30 days? And it actually responds already to a question, which is that the justification for these tariffs, of course, has been the fentanyl issue, the migration issue. But obviously, there's a larger story to play at why these waves of tariffs, based on what Trump has obviously told throughout his campaign and throughout Trump 1, his concerns about the trade deficit, the treatment of the United States. So if these issues are not really about fentanyl and they're not really about migration, what happens in this 30 days that's going to change that overall picture?
The reality is that this has nothing to do with fentanyl or illegal immigration. That was just the premise for invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and bypassing congressional oversight in the process. So IEPA needed a foundation in a national emergency, and Trump had a national emergency defined as fentanyl and illegal immigration. Obviously, the data belied the point. There's no evidence that fentanyl is coming from Canada. And for that matter, illegal immigration from Canada doesn't seem to match what the U.S. is concerned about with respect to Mexico. There's a much bigger story unfolding here. One is with respect to USMCA and a clear desire on the part of the Trump administration to renegotiate faster than what had already been on the books, namely July 2026 as the renewal date, given a bizarre sunset clause that had been inserted in the original text. But the much bigger picture here is that these three tariff targets are America's closest trade partners. And that really is the point. Trump is ruffling feathers, if not causing havoc in the global economy, by indicating that nobody is off limits. And by hitting our three closest trade partners, the message is seeping in. Even this morning, Bank of England is downward revising growth estimates, and they're not even expecting to be hit by U.S. tariffs. The fear is that this will just sputter through the global economy and that anyone is fair game if the three closest U.S. trade partners are hit first.
And, you mentioned different waves on different countries. One question comes in about actually just different products. Is there potentially another wave on semiconductors, chips, pharmaceuticals? Is that another wave that we should be putting into this story?
That's really the interesting mystery, because if we go by what Trump has been saying in his pressers, we're a week out from tariffs across the board on pharmaceuticals, on semiconductors, steel, aluminum, and copper. So that's scheduled for February 15. He did say on Friday that he may delay the one on copper. That's really interesting. It suggests potentially that he's trying to figure out how to pull this one off without driving U.S. production of copper into the ground, literally. And so you can kind of insert that as an across-the-board tariff, regardless of source. That's not just Canada. That's not just Mexico. But the details are really intriguing, because what's the legal basis for these tariffs? And if the idea is that he's going to play national security, which is different, keep in mind, than national emergency per se, if he plays this on national security, there's going to be a lot of pushback. And look for the Democrats in particular to start drafting bills to kind of rein in this. We had seen that under Trump 1, at least get the Department of Defense in on declaring something national security. We'll see if they follow through under the 119th Congress.
So look, let's talk some reactions. You started to get at that. Let's talk about what you think the retaliatory actions could be. What is the planning? If in the end of the 30 days we go back to the 25%, what's China doing? And Marc, as I know you are Canadian, and so you've seen some of the response within the Canadian press. Just give us a little bit of the response and the potential reaction.
This is remarkable from the Canadian side. The anger, the frustration, it is deep and it is uniting a divided country that doesn't even have a sitting parliament. So you really have to calibrate this against the past. Sure, Canada has retaliated going back to the steel and aluminum tariffs, but you are seeing American alcohol pulled off provincial liquor store shelves. This is really getting big, and the list is growing as the conversation veers toward March 1st. The Mexicans, though, win the award for the most creative retaliatory threats. First, they vowed to follow what the U.S. did a long time ago called carousel retaliation. This is terrifying if you're an American exporter. The logic of the carousel is that the list rotates every 3 to 6 months. So even if you're not on the list today, you'd better be careful because you may be on the list tomorrow. And the idea is to drive everybody in DC to lobby for some kind of cessation of the tariff threat. The other thing that Mexico did, which was really quite provocative, they decided that it wouldn't just be limited to tariffs, that they were going to retaliate through non-tariff barriers. How the ad valorem equivalent of non-tariffs would be calculated in coming up with kind of a tit-for-tat approach is really hard to come to grips with. But nonetheless, that was quite provocative. Canada also simultaneously said we would go to the WTO and to USMCA to get panels to rule against the United States. They have no expectation that the U.S. would comply with panels at either the WTO or USMCA. But the point again was to raise the audience costs with respect to Trump doing what he's doing. China followed suit. China just the other day filed a WTO case. They know full well that a WTO case will go nowhere. But what they are trying to signal is they are being the reasonable ones here. And look how the U.S. is defying global convention by going off alone. And the idea would be, presumably, China is leading an effort to isolate the United States. And indirectly, they're getting help from Canada and Mexico, both of which are beginning to rethink connections under supply chains with the United States. And remember, there's going to be a breaking point here. If part of the logic of the tariffs is to fast track a redo of USMCA, at what point do Canada and Mexico decide it's not worth the candle? You got to keep in mind something. When Trump did USMCA, the Conservative Party of Canada, which is about to win the next election in March, called it NAFTA 0.5. And also, keep this number in mind. 80% of Mexico's exports to the U.S. come in under the WTO, not under USMCA. So I think Trump has partly overplayed his hand. The deal is not really worth as much as he thinks it is to either of our trade partners.
So what do you think, what is the U.S. going to get out of the tariff side? One of the things that, of course, Trump said is his goal is tariffs as a revenue-raising measure. So what are the revenue-raising implications of this tariff policy? And how do you think that's going to play out?
This is complete fantasy. By all estimates, the effective tariff rate to come close to $4 trillion, which is raised through income taxes, would be well in excess of 70%. Problem there is that you're taxing nothing because above 70%, it's an effective ban on trade. This is pure fantasy. Moreover, the administration likes to rehearse this line that, well, we got more added tariff revenue under Trump 1.0. Yes, indeed. At 25%, at 10%, etc., not 70 plus. And moreover, 80% of that excess revenue was used to compensate American agricultural exporters who are being shut out of foreign markets, notably China. Pure fantasy, and the administration knows it.
Now, one of the points I've heard you raise in some of the conversations that we've had and some of the commentary is that, we are actually focusing a lot on Trump and Trump's tariffs, but this is reflective of a bipartisan approach to trade and tariffs. Maybe if you can give us a little bit of sense of how much of this is bipartisan and how much of this predates Trump, and to what extent is just Trump taking it to another level of something in which there's a lot of bipartisan agreement with, using tariff policy in the way that Trump has been trying to do.
Biden had shifted away from trade policy to industrial policy. He filed 0 WTO cases, and he offered us make-believe trade agreements with no market access commitments whatsoever. In a way, there was no trade policy under Biden. There is a little bit of good news under Trump, and that is, by virtue of his desire to go back on the offense, the U.S. may actually pry open foreign markets. He doesn't need the tariffs to do that. There are other less trade restrictive ways to get that job done. In terms of bipartisanship and consensus here in DC, you would have had exactly the same study called for on anti-dumping countervailing duties. You would have had exactly the same study called for on who's cheating us out there. You would have had exactly the same study called for in terms of, are our trade agreements, of which the U.S. has 14, doing what they're supposed to do? The problem is that under Biden, there was nothing to replace them if the answer was they're not doing anything. And under Trump, if the conclusion is they're not helping enough, who's going to sign a deal if willy-nilly you can pull out fentanyl and illegal immigration as an excuse to essentially abrogate all of your obligations, not only under USMCA, but the World Trade Organization as well? So the line is that's bouncing around town. Trump can either have a trade war or he can push for a new USMCA, but he cannot have both.
Well, tell us, I hope everyone knows USMCA refers to as the, United States agreement with Mexico and Canada on trade, which Trump negotiated himself in the first week, which obviously was the successor to NAFTA. And the WTO, of course, the World Trade Organization, is the kind of critical, framework for global trade. Tell me, what is the, you're suggesting, that these measures, plus the bipartisan consensus that has, been concerned about, the U.S. trade policy. What is the future of global trade policy in this environment? What are the mechanisms by which we use to try to bring agreements on trade in the absence of something on the Western Hemisphere between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, the largest trading partners, and in the ineffectiveness of the World Trade Organization as a major global player in regulating trade?
The reality is that we're already seeing hints of what could come, and that is that other trade partners are going to begin to isolate the United States, and they're already going their own way, despite the fact that the U.S. continues to block, as it did last week, again, as it had under Biden and Trump 1 and Obama, the reconstituting of the appellate body. A European-led initiative called the Multi-Party Interim Arbitration Agreement has given a lot of other countries a workaround. The more that this happens, the more that our trade partners are going to have a separate piece that does not include the United States. And I gotta say, while the WTO is not taken terribly seriously on Capitol Hill, it is taken very seriously in capitals around the world. To this moment, you continue to see the EU and China duke it out at the WTO on everything from electric vehicles to standard essential patents. So this American outlier experience is further isolating us from where the real action is. My God, even Canada is now talking about maybe joining the European Union. This isn't going to help form strong bonds with our allies, never mind our adversaries. And the more that these other countries realize that a separate piece might actually be viable, the more we're in trouble. Europe is signing free trade deals faster than you can blink an eye at, and that is a very disconcerting pattern when you think that they have more than double the free trade agreements that the United States has at this very moment. You're going to see inversions. You're going to see U.S. companies flocking to Canada, which, by the way, has a bilateral with the European Union. That's a hell of a lot of market access to have. And as a side note, so does Mexico. So The more that Trump pushes this narrative, the more American companies are going to begin to take a closer look at both Mexico and Canada, not just as access back to the U.S. under USMCA if it survives, but as fast tracking their exports to the EU. And so the irony here is this is a constrained optimization problem, and it's not clear the Trump administration is calculating this one in a thoughtful manner.
So let's get it. We started to talk a lot about how states going to react, how the global trading system is reacting. Now you're starting to talk about how corporates are going to react. And I want to get to that both in sort of strategic, what do firms do in response? What are they? There's already been a question about what does this mean in terms of the global supply chain? Do they nearshore? Does it bring more production capacity into the United States? What do you think is likely? What are you likely to see in how firms react to this? And maybe even on the normative side, how should firms react to this? How do they protect themselves from the uncertainty of how this is going to go forward?
Uncertainty has never been greater. Not since the 1960s have we seen anything remotely like this in terms of just measured trade policy uncertainty. Companies have a couple of options. The first thing I recommend is get your tariff code right and think carefully about whether you're trading between the three countries that we've been talking about, Canada, Mexico, and the United States, under USMCA versus WTO rules. And potentially look to reclassify on a tariff code by adding or subtracting something to get you into a better position, especially if your choice, like 80% of Mexican exports, is the WTO, not USMCA. Huddle with a customs lawyer or trade lawyer and figure out things like drawback, reclaim tariffs spent on imported inputs, which are then re-exported. And I can't believe I'm saying this in 2025. Take a second look at free trade zones that dot the US, Canada, and US, Mexico borders. Because technically, you can export without tariff impediment from these areas so long as you're exporting back home and no arbitrage with respect to third markets. The other thing is, for the first time, companies are going to have to really get clever politically speaking. Going to have to start offering narratives to their members in Congress, such as, I'm a small Virginia-based company, I've got 10 employees, and we're all going to lose our jobs unless we get guaranteed market access, which we thought we were getting under USMCA. And by the way, we import an engine from China. Without that engine, we're out of business. I can't tell you how many times I've been in the room with US trade negotiators, and when we were pushing free trade, the line has always been, I need a narrative. I need a narrative. I need something to explain on the Hill. Companies need to be explaining themselves, not necessarily the business model, but definitely the narrative that helps someone make this make sense. And get behind your trade association. They're already buzzing. And the day after the announcement of the tariffs with Canada and Mexico, U.S. Chamber of Commerce is already vowing to start taking some pretty big steps, including, and we're all expecting this, legal actions, which will ultimately bring IEEPA to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Well, look, we've talked about states, we've talked about agreements, we've talked about companies. Someone asked in the Q&A, getting at a very personal level, the individual level now. Talk a little bit about this, the removal of the minimis designation for small e-commerce packages. What does it mean to all our Amazon and Temu and shoppers around who are listening? And how is this likely to be implemented by DHS and Border Protection?
I'll tell you, the de minimis at $800 has long been a bit of a thorn in Congress's side. There's been efforts to try and figure out how to systematize this and what kind of money is being left on the table. We don't have the bureaucracy to go after below de minimis exports. And we also don't have the bureaucracy to do different tariff levels by product, by country. So there's a whole bunch of bureaucratic questions that need to be entertained, but you bet the de minimis issue is going to crush a lot of small operations, a lot of small distributors, and put the Customs and Border Protection into a serious bind. This has to be dealt with in a sensible way. And moreover, it can't just be the U.S. in isolation. We're going to have to start coordinating a few efforts with our closest trade partners, assuming they're still willing to talk to us in the near term.
Someone actually asked about whether or not the reduction in the federal workforce actually affect the implementation of this. Your thoughts on it?
Absolutely. There's no ability in this country to differentially assess tariffs by individual countries. It cannot happen. And you add the de minimis issue, you're going to have to multiply the number of tariff code inspectors getting the job done, not just in terms of what's being shipped in airwise, but at every single crossing and seaport. This is a heroic bet, and it's not playing out anytime soon.
Mark, in the remaining few minutes that we have, there have been a number of questions in the chat about the fundamental problem that Trump and a bipartisan consensus has formed about concern of about the trade imbalance, that this is a real problem. This is not a made up problem. This is not, sort of something that's pulled out of thin air. So if this approach to getting kind of very tough, building up the threat level and the risk level on tariffs that the way Trump has is not the right way to go, what is the right way to go to try to deal with the fundamental imbalance that a bipartisan consensus supports and Trump is trying to push it?
There is a fundamental imbalance, and it reflects macroeconomic considerations, and we should stop pretending like we can deal with it through tariffs. I mean, take a look at what happened with the threat on Canada and Mexico. The Canadian dollar took a nosedive to 65 cents US. Guess what the effect of that is? Cheaper exports from Canada. So the reality is that the tariffs aren't facilitating a solution to the trade imbalance, and it's a macroeconomics concern more than a trade policy concern. No one has ever suggested that trade imbalances would be fixed with a tariff. Isn't going to happen. And for all that is said at present about what happened under Trump 1.0, with all the Section 301 tariffs, 4 lists of Section 301 tariffs, Chinese, our imbalance with China went up. So the bigger macro coordination has to happen with less focus on tariffs and more focus on what is actually driving this. Even when you listen to the Trump administration, the line is, yeah, the tariffs are going to hurt, but less regulation, lower taxes, and playing on the value of the US dollar will offset them. Why can't this president go down in history as the most pro-growth president doing the last 3 things and not doing the tariffs? That will be the winning strategy here, as my former student Eric Esty just posed. That would be the winning strategy. Go down in history as the most pro-growth president of all time. Drop the plagiarism of President William McKinley. You got the story wrong. And move on to doing A, B, C, and D. No tariffs. Despite the IEPA angle, sometimes you can do that. No one's saying don't do trade remedies, but do them legally, and then do tax cut, less regulation, and thinking about currency manipulation on the part of our trade partners. By the way, that is one of the studies he called for in his inaugural memo. He knows better.
Look, last question. I got a minute left, which is on the strategy of pushing back. What are the legal strategies that might be pursued to curtail some of these policies? I mean, we talked a little bit about the WTO. We talked about renegotiating the USMCA. Are there other legal strategies that opponents can take that might push against this policy?
Section 301 is already at a federal circuit court right now.
Tell us what
that is the unilateral stick that the U.S. likes to use against China. So that's an enforcement mechanism, and we'll see more of that against other countries as well. So Section 301 is already under domestic legal challenge. IEPA, that will go to the courts. There isn't a clear path on any of the means that Trump is vowing to use to bypass Congress. But at the end of the day, Joel, Congress has to get back into this action. If they don't want to claw back their tariff authority, it's going to be a hard slug for the next 4 years. But there are bills being written right now, and there's a very creative one loosely modeled on a 1930s Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, which ironically was where the first impetus for something that would one day be called NAFTA came from.
Well, Mark, we're going to leave it at that. We've covered a lot of ground in 30 minutes on a very, very important and critical topic to the future of global trade and indeed to the global economic order. And one of the points that you raise is how significant this is. Thank you very much for giving us a deep dive into the tariffs and where this is going to go. We may have you back again in the future to kind of try to catch up on where things go. Let me thank the very significant SFS audience from all over the world that has joined us today. Please look forward to other SFS Fast Break sessions. This is recording. We will be posting this on our SFS social media sites and our YouTube channel for those who want to parse it. Marc can talk a little bit fast, so if you want to read and listen through the podcast to get some of the other details, we welcome you to do it. And thanks very much for attending. We really appreciate it. All the best to you. Thank you, Marc.
Thank you. Be well.